Hello Facebook, I'm Susan from DBX Acoustics, and today's live broadcast is just going to be a short introduction to the brand new ProPG guidance which was released last week. It looks like this, it's very beautiful. ProPG is professional practice guidance on planning and noise. It's been produced jointly by the Institute of Acoustics, the Association of Noise Consultants and the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, and it essentially aims to encourage a coherent design process, good acoustic design when planning new residential developments. It's trying to encourage local authorities to all refer to one document so that planning policy is a little bit more joined up across the country, because at the moment we see quite a few differences between different local authorities. And it's also just trying to set out a really clear assessment process so that acoustic consultants are all working on the same basis, so that local authorities are all working on the same basis, and just so that everything is consistent. The ultimate aim of it obviously is to provide good acoustic conditions for people in their homes. It's all in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework and National Planning Policy as well, which aims to enhance the quality of housing. And because we're going to see so much new housing built over the next few years, it's a very timely and very important document. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to hopefully not get too technical. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what's in the document and what it means in terms of really, a house builder or a developer, what it's going to mean for you. So ProPG only applies to new residential development. It doesn't apply if you are converting a house or if you're converting, actually it will apply if you are converting a previously non-residential premises into residential. It wouldn't apply, for example, if you were converting an existing house into flats. But for any new residential development, this should be the design standard that kicks in. The document is in two parts. It begins with a noise assessment and a risk assessment of your site. So that would be where we do pretty much what we do at the moment for planning anyway. We go out to site and we measure it, we find out just how noisy it is or just how quiet it is in its existing condition. And under ProPG, this then allows us to assess the site's risk for noise, which could be anything from negligible or low risk to medium, moderate or high risk. If a site is found to be of negligible noise risk, then you don't have to go any further, and hopefully planning should then be sped up because noise is not a concern on that particular site. However, it's pretty unlikely. Most sites in the UK would not be negligible risk. It's always worth a try, always worth a look, but generally speaking, after you've had your noise risk assessment, you would expect to progress to stage 2 of the assessment. And this is where things get quite a bit more detailed than we've previously seen in planning guidance, but I think detailed in quite a positive way, not really designed to punish the developer and not really designed to increase red tape, but just designed to make sure that things are being done well and consistently. So when you go to stage 2 of your assessment, there are 4 elements that they wish you to consider, and you can probably see me glancing away over your shoulder because I've got them written up in front of me so that I don't forget. So the first element is good acoustic design process. This is obviously something that I bang on about all the time. It's something that acoustic consultants think is really important anyway, but it's become a little bit more formalised in ProPG. It gives a bit more of an idea to developers what you should be expecting from your acoustic consultant and about what you should be doing to try and get good conditions for people. So as part of good acoustic design process, you should have your acoustic consultant on board in the scheme as early as you possibly can, because the elements that make up a good acoustic design process don't start with what you make your building out of. Absolutely key to the process should be looking at the site and considering how best the housing can be placed on the site in order to provide maximum noise screening. So for example, if you've got a site I recently worked on right next to the A1M and you have got residential housing right next to the motorway, we've used a block of the housing to actually provide noise screening to act as a noise barrier to the rest of the site, just by putting a nice solid block of housing along that motorway facade. So looking at that sort of thing, looking at how you can lay out the site to provide maximum screening to protect people from noise. Then also looking at the orientation of the buildings as well, so that wherever possible, the more noise sensitive facades, so the facades with bedrooms and living rooms on them, face away from the sources of noise. So again, on that site on the A1M, we've got on that block of flats that we've got that's adjacent to the motorway, the whole facade, which overlooks the road, is just kitchens and bathrooms and storage rooms. All of the bedrooms and the living rooms have windows that open to the interior of the site, so they're really well shielded from the noise. The second element, this is not working out very well, is it? There we go, I'll just move you slightly. The good acoustic design also requires you to consider, can you do anything to reduce the noise sources or remove the noise sources? So for example, if you had something like a transformer that was on the site and that was a noise source, you could be looking at whether you can shield it or enclose it. Then we move into having a look at the building construction, and the design is going to be quite concerned then with the internal ambient noise level guidelines, which are set out in BS 8233. Now we use BS 8233 at the moment. It is a British standard that we use to assess residential amenity in new and converted properties. ProPG takes it a little bit further, because instead of using BS 8233 limits as absolute limits above which thou shalt not develop or above which thou shalt not go, ProPG introduces the concept of internal noise conditions being either unreasonable, which is where they are between 5 and 10 decibels above BS 8233 guidance, or unacceptable, where they are 10 dB or more above BS 8233. Now, this sort of means implicitly that anything that is up to 5 decibels in excess of BS 8233 is not unreasonable. And that may well be a debate that we find ourselves having with planning officers in the future. Is it reasonable if, for example, predicted noise levels with ventilation with open windows are 1 or 2 dB above BS 8233 guidance? Is it reasonable to expect that developer then to go to the cost of installing alternative means of ventilation? And I think this is going to be the most controversial thing in the document, although it's not really been spoken about very much at the moment. It's certainly one to watch. Certainly the guidance says that where you reach unreasonable conditions, so in that 5 to 10 dB above band, then you should be trying to avoid the noise issues. You should be looking at installing additional mitigation measures to try and bring yourself back down to that reasonable area. And when you get to the unacceptable band, which is 10 dB above, then the recommendation is to prevent the noise impact. So that is definitely to be avoided. So then we do what we would normally do. We start looking at the building constructions, how it's ventilated, how we're going to keep the noise out to achieve those reasonable conditions inside. So that's the second element. The third element is to look at external amenity. And again, ProPG here generally goes along with BS 8233 and World Health Organization guidance. And it does recommend that you should be trying to have at least some areas of residential amenity which are below 55 dB LAEQ, which is an average noise level during the daytime. What ProPG does pull out very clearly though is the guidance in BS 8233, which is often lost, which is that if you can't actually achieve this, it doesn't necessarily mean that planning should be refused. In fact, planning should not be refused solely on the grounds that the external amenity areas are not quite enough. Not all sites, particularly in urban areas, are going to be able to achieve that sort of level. So ProPG refers to the more detailed guidance where you can also look at whether there is a quiet amenity area within a 5-minute walk of the development. So for example, if you're within a 5-minute walk of a park or a tranquil area, it will also look at whether some level of tranquility can be provided. And then the final element that we have to look at is other relevant issues. Now this one becomes quite complex and I've got some more notes up here. So other relevant issues to me is where the extra work for the acoustic consultant comes in. We have to look at compliance with local and national policy, so we would have to look at the design fairly holistically really to see whether it meets any national policy out there relating to noise, which at the moment it will, because we're working to planning policy guidance and the NPPF, which is the National Planning Policy Framework, I think. Local authorities do have their own guidance. Certainly Manchester City Council has got its own very clear guidance on residential development, and ProPG cannot override that. It's not a standard, it's not mandatory, it is just guidance. So any local planning policy has to take precedence. You're also then encouraged to look at the likely occupants and what their needs could be. And I find this one very interesting again, particularly in terms of the external amenity areas that I was just talking about. ProPG points out that different groups of people have different requirements. So for example, a family with young children is going to have a different requirement for external amenity area than, for example, somebody like my mum. Hello, mum. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect the elderly to walk 5 minutes to get to an area of tranquility, whereas perhaps it would be reasonable to ask that of families. Similarly, students may not have quite such a requirement for peace and quiet during the daytime as young families or the elderly. So we can bring these considerations into play when we're discussing the noise conditions as well. Acoustics also has to be assessed, against any unintended adverse consequences, and it also has to be considered against any wider planning objectives. So what this means is, for example, if the only way to meet the acoustic conditions would be to install a large noise barrier, and this meant that people would only be looking at the noise barrier and they wouldn't have any sort of view, or if acoustic design would conflict with things like secure by design, for example, then it's not necessarily the acoustic design that has to take precedence. Everything has to be considered together. So I mentioned secure by design there. Secure by design will often encourage having spaces that overlook the street so that people do feel that they can walk down the street safely, that there are people who might see them, they might be observed. In that case, you might also therefore find that the habitable rooms of the households are on the noisier facades of the building and overlooking the street, and that's a compromise that may have to be reached. So there's definitely a lot of scope in the guidance for holistic discussion, not considering acoustics as an item on its own and just getting it out there as part of the overall design and not a bolt-on. So that's element 4. And then all of this information comes together in what is now being called the acoustic design statement. So that's the document that your acoustic consultant will put together for you. It will include the details of the noise survey and the risk assessment, and then it will go through each of the elements of the design process that are required by stage 2 of ProPG. And the acoustic design statement also includes now a recommendation to the decision maker based on all of the elements of ProPG that have been worked through. So the recommendations can be, there are 2 really, which are to grant permission. There's grant permission without conditions, grant permission with additional noise conditions, and then the final 2 options are to recommend refusal. It's very unlikely, to be honest, that you would ever receive a report from a noise consultant that would recommend refusal, because we'd always be trying to find the solution that allows permission to be granted. Really, our job is all about the mitigation and trying to make it work, trying to work with our clients to make it work. But it is an option to recommend refusal as well. And at that point, it all goes off to the local planning authority as usual. They will then consider the report, the information within it, and they will make their decision on whether planning permission can be granted and what conditions apply. So what does this actually mean practically? That's a lot of waffle, isn't it? I think there's a bit more work involved for acoustic consultants, but I don't think this is one of those standards which is there as a bit of a money spinner. I think it is there to integrate acoustic design much more deeply in the design process and the planning process. So I think that could be a really good thing. That could actually lead to cost savings for developers as well. If they get the acoustic consultants on board early and take on board the advice, it could avoid costly mistakes and the need for expensive mitigation or ventilation options. I think it could be really good for getting us a bit of consistency across the country in terms of planning, because at the moment every different authority has different requirements, and it can be very, very difficult to know where you stand. Even different EHOs within the same authority will have different opinions on what you should do. So a bit of joined up thinking and joined up guidance is certainly going to be very welcome. And ultimately, hopefully, it is a document which is going to lead to better housing conditions, at least better acoustic housing conditions. So that can only be a good thing. So in summary, we think it's a good thing. We hope there will be some more planning and noise guidance for other topics, because at the moment this one only applies to new residential development. But it's something to be encouraged. I think we've suffered a lot from the government sort of trying to cut red tape a few years ago and just taking out a lot of guidance documents that local authorities were able to refer to. So all in all, it's a good thing. As a bit of a waffle, I will be writing a slightly more coherent blog post about ProPG to go with this webcast, so please keep an eye out for that. I'll post a link to it underneath as well once it's done. And of course, if you've got any questions, you can always contact us at DBX Acoustics. You can contact us through our Facebook page or just give us a call. We're on 0161 711 0320. So I hope that was useful, and like I say, if you've got any questions, do just let us know. Take care.